What actually happens if you double your training volume? This is a question that is commonly asked, and there are two sides of the story. One is train with loads of volume, one is train with a higher intensity and less volume. But what actually equals more muscle growth? So today we're going to be dissecting a new study which was released in 2026 earlier this year. And at the end I'm going to give you my opinion on what I think is best for most people. Now, this is where studies and science become slightly conflicting because there are various different studies that ultimately do produce different results. So I guess the answer we'll get into later on, but we'll start by going into what the study actually looked at, what the results were, and what my thoughts are at the end. So first of all, this was an 8-week study looking at 25 participants. So first of all, we can say this was a very limited case study. There were only 25 participants and it was only for a period of 8 weeks. So can we notice any meaningful change in that time? Well, yes and no. Of course, it's a very limited window. A study like this would need to be undertaken numerous times and for a much longer period for us to actually get more conclusive results, you could argue. So what actually happened in the study is they measured the leg growth. On one leg, they trained for 18 sets per week for the 8 weeks. And on the second leg, they trained 33 sets per week on the opposing leg. And what's also important here is they trained every set to failure, which is obviously the correct intensity. If you want to stimulate as much muscle growth as possible, if you don't know what training to failure is, look at my previous videos or go on my Instagram, because I post stuff like this all the time where I'm helping hopefully educate and teach you the basics of muscle growth and fat loss. And they recorded the results by measuring the cross-sectional area of the muscle before and after and looked at the difference. Now obviously that just means the size difference. How much did that muscle grow? And they took a percentage. And what they found was for the leg in which they trained 18 sets per week, saw a growth of 7% on average. And the leg that trained 33 sets per week, they saw a growth of 10% on average. So looking at that without actually going into much detail, you would think, okay, the leg or the training method of training more volume, 33 sets per week, is actually going to create more muscle growth than just training 18 sets per week. So you could argue that based on these results, more volume actually is better, which slightly counters the modern, I guess, argument that less training is more effective as long as you're training to a higher intensity. And there is a peak where volume becomes most effective and then it sort of levels out. So more volume doesn't necessarily always mean better, but this study actually does show that perhaps more volume is better for you, which is something that I don't necessarily agree with or haven't necessarily agreed with in the past. And we'll get into my thoughts very shortly on this. A few caveats that you actually need to consider is 3% difference isn't actually that much. Now, it could have been the stronger leg that saw more growth. It could have been the weaker leg that saw more growth for various reasons. The strong leg is just better at training to failure. Therefore, you might have stimulated a little bit more growth. Or the weaker leg is slightly weaker than the stronger leg. Therefore, the weaker leg actually got more growth from this study purely because they were just training it more. So there are a few caveats to consider, and also 3% is actually, in the grand scheme of things, not that much. You could train for another 20 weeks and that can sort of level itself out easily within the 20 weeks. So there are some caveats that you need to consider in this study. So what are my thoughts on the results, and does this mean we should be training with more volume on every exercise that we do? My honest answer is no. I don't think you should be training with this much volume. For the most part, this is going to be way too much. You're going to generate too much fatigue and you're going to stunt your recovery. And there's just really no need. I mean, for an extra 3%, do you need to be training 33 sets per week? One, do you actually have the time to do that? Most of you watching this, I assume, won't. And two, do you want to be spending that long in the gym regardless? 33 sets a week for one muscle group is a hell of a lot. And if you're doing that for every muscle group, you're talking close to 200 sets per week. So it's very unrealistic, and for a potential 3% difference, it just isn't worth it in my opinion. And I say for the most people, this is actually going to stunt your recovery, and you're just not going to get the benefits for the additional fatigue. So it just isn't worth it in my opinion. Now, a lot of studies show, and this is the philosophy that I guess follow and get most of my clients to follow, is less volume, higher intensity. Most of my clients train 3 to 4 days per week, and I myself train 4 days a week. And let's say, for example, my chest, I do about 8 working sets per week, maybe 10, 12 at a push. I'll do 2, maybe 3 chest exercises per session, and I'll do 2 sets per exercise. So that is 4 to 6 sets per session for one muscle group. Likewise with my quads. In fact, it's pretty much similar for all of my muscle groups. The only difference is at the moment I'm training to get to the front lever. So I think I do more volume on my back, but that's purely more of from a skill perspective rather than a total like hypertrophy muscle growth perspective. I'm not trying to maximize my back gains at the minute. Of course, I'm going to be growing a lot of muscle in my back, but the main goal for me with my back is, can I get the front lever? So yeah, for that reason, most of my clients train with a high intensity, low volume, and I get them to send me videos of their training so I can actually see how they're training, to what intensity, and see if they're actually training to failure, to see if they can stimulate enough muscle growth. And obviously we do weekly check-ins. So if you're interested in one-to-one coaching, obviously that's what I offer. The link is in the bio to my YouTube channel, and I'll link it in the comments below. So feel free to apply if you have goals to lose weight, build muscle, get fitter, you've got a run coming up or something like that you need help with. Click the link in the bio and apply for one-to-one coaching. Anyway, digress slightly there. To summarize, more volume does not necessarily mean more growth. You could argue through this one study that yes, it does stimulate a little bit more growth, but it's so limited. There was only 25 people participating. It was only done for a course of 8 weeks. In my opinion, that just isn't enough time to give any conclusive factual evidence. There's so much evidence out there to show that actually you don't need to train with this much volume, and you just need to train with high intensity each session to stimulate as much growth as possible. So if you're short on time, which most people are, you don't want to be spending hours in the gym. Go into the gym, smash a 20, 30, 45-minute workout, 2 sets per exercise, 5 to 6 exercises per session. And if you're really short of time, you can even superset those exercises by doing different muscle groups back to back. So you could do a chest exercise followed by perhaps a bicep exercise with about 20-second rest in between both of those sets. That is how you're going to maximize your muscle growth. The most important thing is training to or close to failure, i.e. you could no longer lift that weight anymore. So do I think you need to train with this much volume? No. If you want to, go for it, but I would strongly recommend higher intensity, lower volume, because we don't want to spend our lives in the gym and focusing everything towards our health and fitness. Of course, it's a massive part of our life, but we don't want to dedicate our whole life to it. Plus, the gym isn't the only aspect we need to look at. We obviously need to look at our diet as well. So pick a plan you can stick to. Go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. Spend no more than 45 minutes to an hour there. Focus on your diet, train with intensity, and enjoy your life. And if you want to apply for one-to-one coaching, click the link in the bio, click the link in the comments. I've got a load of free resources, free recipe books that are over 120 recipes between 2 of them, low calorie, high protein that will get you shredded, so you don't have to eat boring, shitty foods. You can actually eat foods you enjoy and still lose weight. I've got training splitter templates. I've got all sorts on there. Click the links to download them. As always, like the video, comment for the sake of the algorithm, and if you haven't already, then please subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.